The winter of 1847 was a hard one, even for a man who knew the mountains. The air wasn't just cold. It was a sharp, biting thing that found every gap in a man's furs. The man in the small, lonely cabin was used to it. His name was Pierre, a French-Canadian who had spent more years talking to beavers and pine trees than to other people. His world was the deep silence of snow and the soft crunch of his own boots. His cabin was a small, sturdy thing built with his own hands. It smelled of wood smoke, dried meat, and the lonely smell of a man who lives by himself. His only company most days was the old songs from his childhood, the ones in French that his grandmother had sung. He would hum them while checking his trap lines, the melodies getting lost in the vast, white quiet of the Rockies. One evening, the silence changed. It wasn't broken by the howl of a wolf or the wind, but by the sound of movement. Many movements. Pierre went still, his hand reaching for his rifle by the door. He peered out through a crack in the logs. What he saw made him hold his breath. Not a war party, but a small group of Nez Perce people, maybe 10 or 12, moving slowly through the deep snow. They looked exhausted. In the middle of them, carried on a simple stretcher of hides and poles, was an old man. Even from a distance, Pierre could see the man was very sick. His face was gray, not from the cold, but from something inside. Pierre was a cautious man, a trapper learned to be. But he also knew the rules of this hard land. You did not turn away people in trouble when the snow was this deep. With a slow breath, he unbarred his heavy wooden door and stepped outside, raising an empty hand in what he hoped was a clear sign of peace. The group stopped. A younger man with a serious face and eyes that held a deep worry stepped forward. His name, Pierre would learn, was Red Feather. He spoke in a mix of hand signs, a few words of English, and the Chinook trade language that was common in these parts. The message was simple but heavy. The old man was their chief, a respected leader named Tukotnik. A burning sickness had taken him on their journey. They were far from their winter camp. They were not asking for medicine or magic. They only asked for a warm place, a simple shelter, where their chief could spend his final hours in peace before his spirit traveled on. They believed Pierre's cabin, a neutral ground, was a good place for this. Pierre looked at the old chief's face. Even in sickness, there was a dignity there, a strength in the quiet lines. He looked at the faces of the people around him, tired and full of a quiet sorrow. His own cabin felt suddenly very small, but also very warm. He nodded. He stepped back and motioned for them to come inside. The cabin, built for one, was very crowded with so many. But the Nez Perce people moved with a quiet, careful respect. They made space near the fire for the chief, laying him on Pierre's own bedroll. They did not make a mess or take anything. They simply settled into the space, their low voices murmuring in their own language, creating a somber atmosphere that filled the room. Pierre put a kettle of snow on the fire to melt for water. He felt like a ghost in his own home, moving around the edges of their sacred moment. He watched as Red Feather and an older woman tended to the chief, wiping his brow with melted snow, speaking softly to him. The chief's breathing was uneven, a raspy sound that filled the pauses in their whispers. As night fell completely, the only light came from the fire. The shadows danced on the log walls. The chief's condition seemed to grow worse. He became restless, his head moving side to side, his dry lips murmuring words Pierre could not understand. His hands twitched at the hides covering him. Red Feather looked up at Pierre, his face lit by the flickering flames. "His spirit is ready to cross the great river," he said, his voice low. "But the way is dark for him. He is lonely for the journey. He listens for a song from when he was a boy, to guide him. But that song is from a place we are not. We cannot sing it. Pierre felt a deep helplessness. He was a man of traps and rifles, of snow and trade. He was not a medicine man or a singer of spirits. He had nothing to give this dying leader. He looked at the old man's pained face, at the family around him sharing in his struggle. Then, without really thinking why, Pierre moved. He slowly knelt on the hard-packed earth floor next to the chief. He felt every eye in the small cabin on him. His throat was tight, and his heart was pounding. What was he doing? He wasn't a singer, but he opened his mouth, and a sound came out. Soft at first, then a little stronger. It was a simple song, the oldest one he knew. A French lullaby his grandmother had sung to him by another fireplace, in another life, across an ocean. Asterisk. A la Clairefontaine. Asterisk, asterisk mean a long promenade. Asterisk, his voice was rough from disuse and smoke, and the tune was simple. It was a song about a clear fountain, about remembering a loved one. It was filled with a homesick tenderness for a world long gone. The effect in the crowded cabin was immediate. The chief's restless movements slowed. His furrowed brow began to smooth. His ragged breathing seemed to find the slow, gentle rhythm of the lullaby. The murmuring in the room stopped, replaced by a profound, listening silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and Pierre's soft, stumbling voice singing a child's song from far away. He finished the little verse. In the quiet that followed, the old chief's eyes fluttered open. They were clear for a moment, and they found Pierre's face. The old man's hand, thin and strong, came up and grasped Pierre's wrist. His grip was surprising. He said a single word, on a breath that was more air than sound. Red Feather leaned close, then looked at Pierre, his own eyes wide with something like awe. He translated the word, his voice a whisper of wonder in the firelight. He says, "Home," he says, "you have sung my spirit home." A final soft sigh left the old chief's lips. His hand relaxed, and in the warmth of the cramped cabin, surrounded by his people and a stranger's song, Chief Tukutnik was gone. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a peaceful kind of heavy. The terrible rasping sound was gone. The chief's face, which had been tight with pain, now looked calm, like a man sleeping after a long day's work. Pierre slowly pulled his wrist from the old man's gentle grasp. He felt a strange mix of things, sadness, for sure, but also a warmth he couldn't explain. He had felt useless, but his simple song had done something. He just sat there on the hard floor, not knowing what to do next. The older woman, who Pierre guessed was the chief's wife, moved first. She placed a gentle hand on the chief's forehead and closed his eyes. She did not cry out loud. A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek, but her expression was one of love and also relief. His struggle was over. She looked at Pierre and gave a slow, deep nod. It was a thank you that needed no words. Then the quiet work began. The Nez Perce people did not fall apart in loud grief. They moved with a purpose, a solemn duty. Red Feather and another man carefully began to prepare the chief's body. They used clean hides and soft fur, talking to him softly in their language as they worked, telling him things Pierre would never understand. It was clear this was a sacred ritual, a way of getting him ready for a much longer journey than the one that brought him here. Pierre stood up, his knees cracking, feeling like he was in the way again. He went to the far corner of his cabin, near his small table, and tried to make himself busy. He stirred the fire, added a log. He melted more snow for water. He wanted to give them their space, to show respect for their private goodbye. He watched them from the corner of his eye, struck by the quiet dignity of it all. There was a deep love in this crowded room, a love as solid as the log walls. After some time, Red Feather came over to him. The warrior's face was serious, but the earlier worry was gone from his eyes. Now there was a deep, thoughtful look. "You gave him a great gift," Red Feather said, his voice low. "You sang him across the dark water when his own people could not. You did the work of a closest brother, of a son." Pierre nodded, still feeling a little awkward. "It was just a song. An old song. I am glad it gave him peace." Red Feather shook his head slowly. "It was not just a song. It was the right song at the last moment. In our way, this creates a bond, a debt." He searched for the right word. "A potlatch. A sacred duty between you and him. And because he was our head, our heart, this duty is now between you and all of our people." Pierre listened, but he didn't fully understand. He was a trapper. He understood debts in beaver pelts and rifle powder. This sounded different, bigger. It sounded like the kind of thing from an old story. He just nodded again, not wanting to be rude. "You owe me nothing," he said honestly. "I only offered my roof." Red Feather almost smiled, but it was a smile full of meaning. "It is not about what you think you are owed. It is about what we must now do. You are Tukuknik's heart brother now. This changes things. For you. For us." As dawn began to lighten the sky, turning the black outside the window to a deep gray, the preparations were finished. The chief was wrapped snugly, ready for travel. The group shared a little of the food. Pierre offered some dried meat and hot tea in a quiet breakfast. The mood was still solemn, but the sharp edge of sorrow had softened. When it was time to leave, they all filed out of the small cabin. The cold morning air hit Pierre's face, sharp and clean. The men carefully lifted the chief's body. Red Feather turned to Pierre one last time. He placed a hand on his own chest, then gestured to Pierre. "We will take our chief to his resting place. Remember what I said, heart brother. The mountains have ears, and the river has a memory. We will not forget." Pierre stood in his doorway, watching as the small group moved back into the tall, silent pines. They were soon swallowed by the shadows and the snow. The deep quiet of the wilderness rushed back in, louder than before. He stepped back inside, closed the heavy door, and barred it. His cabin felt huge and empty now. The spot by the fire where the chief had lain just looked like a patch of packed earth again. For a long time, Pierre just sat on his stool, staring at the flames. The whole night felt like a dream. The crowded cabin, the sick old man, the song, the peaceful death. The words heart brother and sacred debt echoed in his mind. He shrugged to himself. It was a kind thing they said, a poetic way of saying thank you. People said such things in moments of high emotion. He went about his day. He checked his traps along the frozen creek, the routine work calming his thoughts. He skinned a rabbit for his supper. He mended a tear in his mittens. The strange event of the night began to fade, packed away in his mind like just another unusual story from a life full of them. The mountains were always giving you stories. A strange animal track, a sudden storm, a meeting with another loner at a trading post. This was just another one. A sad one, but a good one too. He had helped. Days turned into a week, then two. The memory of the song and the old chief's face would come to him sometimes when he was humming by the fire, but it grew fainter, softer. Life returned to its normal rhythm of solitude and survival. The deep snows continued. He was alone again, just a man in a big, quiet world. The idea of a debt, of a bond with an entire people far away, seemed like a fragment of that dream, something that belonged to the world of firelight and whispers, not to the bright, cold, empty day. The next 2 weeks were quiet, the kind of quiet that gets inside a man's ears. After the Nez Perce left, the silence of the mountains felt different to Pierre. It wasn't just empty anymore. It felt watched. Not in a bad way, but like the trees themselves, remembered what happened and were waiting to see what came next. He'd be out checking his trap lines, and for a second, he'd think he heard a whisper or see a shape between the pines that wasn't a deer. But it was always just the wind or a shadow. He tried to put it all out of his mind. He told himself it was a sad, strange moment that was over. He was a practical man. His world was made of real things. The weight of a pelt, the sharpness of his skinning knife, the taste of bitter coffee in the morning. This talk of spirits and debts and being a heart brother belonged to a different world. A world of stories told around fires, not the world of a trapper living alone in the snow. But sometimes, at night, he'd see the old chief's face. Not the sick face, but the face in that last moment peaceful knowing. He'd hear his own rough voice singing the child's song in the smoky cabin. It made his chest feel tight in a way he couldn't name. He wasn't a man for big feelings. He'd lived alone too long for that. So he'd shake his head, poke the fire, and think about tomorrow's work. One afternoon, he was following a creek bed, looking for otter sign. The sun was weak, but it glittered on the ice. He was thinking of nothing in particular, his mind empty and calm. When he saw the first marked dot, it was on the smooth trunk of a large aspen tree, right at eye level. A symbol had been carved into the white bark with a sharp knife. It wasn't random. It was a clear picture, a small, simple bird in flight, and underneath it, a single straight line like a river. The carving was fresh, the wood inside still pale and clean against the gray bark dot Pierre stopped. His breath made a cloud in the air. He looked around slowly. Nothing moved. The forest was still. He reached out and touched the mark. Who would do this? And why here? Trappers sometimes blaze trails, but this wasn't a trail mark. This was a picture, a message. A little chill that had nothing to do with the cold went down his back. He remembered Red Feather's words. The mountains have ears, and the river has a memory. He pushed the thought away. Coincidence. Maybe a lone hunter from another tribe passing through. He moved on, but now his eyes were restless, searching the trees. 2 days later, he found another one. This was farther from his cabin, near a rocky outcrop he used as a landmark. This symbol was different. It looked like a bear's paw, but inside the paw was a single human eye. It was carved into the soft red wood of a cedar. Now his heart started to beat a little faster. This was no coincidence. Someone was moving through his territory. Someone who was leaving signs. But not signs for themselves. The marks were placed where he, Pierre, would naturally see them. On his regular routes. They were showing him they knew his habits. That night in his cabin, the silence felt different. It felt like a held breath. He kept his rifle closer to his bed. Was it a warning? Was it the Nez Perce checking on him? Or was it someone else? The mountains were not always friendly. There were other tribes, and there were bad men of all kinds who came to the wilderness. For the next several days, he saw nothing. No more marks. No sound. He started to think maybe he was letting his imagination run wild. The loneliness could do that to a man. Make him see patterns where there were none. Then, one morning just before dawn, he was woken by a sound. It was the softest crunch of snow. Not an animal. An animal was either silent or clumsy. This was the careful, quiet step of a human. He was off his bedroll in an instant, rifle in hand, his back against the cold log wall beside the window. He peered out through a tiny gap, his own breathing loud in his ears. Outside, in the blue-gray light, a single figure stood. It was a Nez Perce warrior. He was alone. He wasn't looking at the cabin. He was facing the trees, perfectly still, as if standing guard. He held a long spear, and the first light of the sun caught the feathers tied to it. Pierre watched, frozen. The man didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at the spot where Pierre was hidden behind the wall. It was as if he knew Pierre was there. He didn't smile or raise a hand. He simply gave a single, slow nod. Then he turned and walked, without a sound, into the forest and was gone. Pierre stayed by the wall for a long time, the cold from the logs seeping into his shoulder. His mind was racing. That was no chance meeting. That warrior was placed there. He was a sentry. He was watching the cabin. But watching it from what? Or watching for what? And the nod. That was not a nod of greeting. It was a nod of acknowledgement, like one soldier to another on watch. It said, Asterisk, I am here. You are seen. All is well. Asterisk, the pieces began to fit together in his mind, and the picture they made was both comforting and terrifying. The marks on the trees. They weren't from a stranger. They were from his people. The people of the old chief. They were letting him know they were nearby. They were watching over him. Because of the debt. Because he was the heart brother. Red Feather's words came back to him, clear and heavy as stone. This duty is now between you and all of our people. This was not a story. This was not a poetic thank you. This was real. They were acting on it. They were weaving him into their world with their quiet signs and their silent guards. They were treating his solitary cabin like it was one of their own lodges, a place that needed to be protected. Pierre put his rifle down. He sat by the fire, but he didn't feel the warmth. He felt a huge weight settling on him. This was a debt that could not be paid with a handful of pelts or a bag of flour. This was a debt that tied his life to theirs. And he had no idea what it meant or what they would do next. The loneliness he had known for years was gone. In its place was something vast and strange and waiting. The days after the silent guard were the strangest Pierre had ever known. He went through his routines, the traps, the fire, the cooking, but it all felt different. It felt like he was performing, like someone was always watching from the trees. The mountains no longer felt empty. They felt full of a quiet, patient presence. He would find a pile of freshly cut firewood neatly stacked near his door in the morning, or a plump grouse, already cleaned and prepared, would be hanging from a low branch by his path, gifts, silent reminders. He tried to go about his business as normal, but a thought kept growing in his mind, heavy as a stone. This was not going to end. This debt, this bond, was not something that would fade. They were acting like he was one of them, and that meant their troubles were now his troubles. He'd heard whispers at the last trading post, talk carried on the wind like the smell of distant smoke. There was a great pressure coming from the east. More and more settlers. Soldiers making new lines on maps. Old treaties being spoken of with angry words. The Nez Perce were being pushed. Everyone in the mountains knew it. That's what the guard was for. They weren't just protecting him from wolves or random thieves. They were protecting their heart brother because something bigger was coming. A storm. And he was tied to them right in the middle of it. The thought made him want to run. A deep old instinct told him to pack his best pelts, take his rifle, and just walk north for a month. Lose himself in lands where no one knew his face or his story. He was a man built for being alone. This responsibility felt too big, too tangled. But then he'd sit by his fire at night and remember the old chief's hand on his wrist. The feeling of that final, peaceful breath in the crowded cabin. He had sung a man home. You can't just walk away from a moment like that. It sticks to your soul. Running would feel like stealing something, though he couldn't say what. So he stayed. But the waiting was worse than anything. The silence was now a thing he listened to, trying to hear what was coming. He stopped finding the small gifts. The forest seemed to go still again. But this was a different stillness. It was the calm before thunder. Even the animals seemed to feel it. He saw fewer tracks, heard fewer birds. One evening, the weather changed. A warm wind, strange for the season, blew up from the south. It smelled of wet earth and pine. But underneath it was another smell, the smell of many people, of horses, of smoke from many fires. It was a smell that did not belong in his lonely valley. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. The wind sighed around the corners of the cabin. Then, just before the deepest part of the night, he heard it. Not a single sound, but a collection of them. The far-off whinny of a horse, quickly hushed. The faint, metallic chink of something, like a bit or a bridle. A cough, suppressed. He sat up, his heart hammering against his ribs. They were out there. Not just a scout or a small band. Many. The sounds were all around, distant but everywhere. He moved to the window, his hands cold and clumsy. He peeked out. The moon was behind clouds, but the strange warm wind had cleared patches of sky. In the faint light, he saw shapes. Dark, solid shapes against the lighter snow at the edge of the tree line. Not trees. Men on horseback. They were motionless, just watching. A line of them. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw more. And more. They were in the meadow to the south. They were among the trees to the north. They were not hiding. They were simply there. A great, silent circle around his tiny cabin. His breath caught. It was one thing to think about a debt, to imagine a people somewhere far off. It was another to have them arrive, an army of shadows at your doorstep. For a wild moment, fear took him. Was this an end? Had he misunderstood everything? He must have made a sound, or they saw the pale flash of his face at the window. One of the shapes detached itself from the line and began to walk a horse slowly toward the cabin. Pierre stepped back from the window, his mind blank. He heard the soft thud of boots landing in snow. Then a knock. Not a hard knock. A firm, respectful tap on his heavy door dot. This was it. There was no running now. He was a trapper, and the trap, of his own making, had finally closed. He took a deep, shaking breath to steady himself. He walked to the door, his hand pausing on the wooden bar. He thought of his rifle, leaning by the fireplace. But what was the use? If they meant harm, they would have just come in. He lifted the bar. It made a loud, scraping sound in the quiet. He pulled the door open. Red Feather stood there. He looked older than he had just weeks before. There were new lines of tiredness around his eyes, but his gaze was steady and clear. He was not dressed for a short journey. He was dressed for war and for traveling a long, hard road. He had paint on his face, not for battle, but in the solemn lines of a man with a heavy duty. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. The wind blew between them, carrying the scent of hundreds of horses and the quiet sounds of a vast, waiting crowd. "Heart, brother," Red Feather said. His voice was tired, but strong. Pierre could only nod. He looked past Red Feather's shoulder. In the broken moonlight, he could see them clearly now. Row upon row of warriors. Men with stern, patient faces. They sat on their horses, their eyes fixed not on him with anger, but with a kind of solemn expectation. There were women and children, too. He realized now, further back in the darkness, a whole moving village of people waiting in the cold night. He had never seen so many people in one place in the wilderness. 800. 1,000. More. The number didn't matter. It was everyone. He looked back at Red Feather, his own voice a dry whisper. "What is happening?" Red Feather's eyes held his. "The talking is over. The paper words are broken. We are being forced from our land. We must leave the bones of our fathers and go toward a new place we do not know. He said it simply, a fact as hard as Rock. Pierre understood. The storm was here. This was the Exodus. Red Feather continued. We are traveling a dangerous road. Soldiers will look for us. Other tribes may not understand our passing. It is a road of great danger. He paused, and his next words settled on Pierre like a weight. You sang our chief's spirit home. You are his brother. A brother does not get left behind when the people move. A brother does not sit in a lonely cabin while his family travels into danger. He gestured out to the vast, silent assembly. We have come. The debt must be settled. You gave a song for one life. We now give a place for your life. With us. It was not a question. It was not an invitation to discuss. It was a statement of fact, as real as the mountain at his back. They had not come to ask him to join. They had come to collect him, to fulfill the bond, to make him truly part of the people. Pierre stood in his doorway, a solitary man in a wool shirt, looking out at a sea of faces. His old life, the life of silence and solitude, was over. It had ended the moment he sang that song. He just hadn't known it until now. The cabin, the traps, the lonely songs, it was all already a memory. He either stepped forward into that sea of people, or he turned his back on a promise he didn't even know he had made. He looked at Red Feather's waiting face. He looked at the chief's old wife, whom he could now see on a horse nearby, her eyes on him. He thought of the quiet guard in the dawn. He gave one slow, final nod. I will need a moment, he said, his voice rough. Red Feather nodded back, a flash of deep respect in his eyes. We will wait. Pierre turned from the doorway and the sea of watching eyes. The inside of his cabin felt like a dream he was already waking from. The fire was just embers, glowing red in the dark. This small, smoky space had been his whole world. Now, it was just a shell. He moved without thinking, his hands doing what they knew. He didn't take much. What do you bring from one life to another? His best rifle, of course. His powder horn and shot bag. His sharp skinning knife and his flint for fire. He rolled his one good wool blanket. He left the heavy iron pot, the stack of furs waiting for trade, the extra traps hanging on the wall. They belonged to the trapper, and the trapper was gone. He put on his heaviest coat and his snowshoes, which leaned by the door. He looked around one last time. The stool by the fire, the bedroll on the floor, the memory of a song in the air. He picked up his pack and his rifle and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. He did not bar it. Let the wind or the wolves have it. Red Feather was waiting, holding the reins of a sturdy, calm-looking horse. It was saddled, and a bedroll and a small bag of supplies were tied behind the saddle. They had come prepared. They had known his answer before he did. Pierre slung his pack over the saddle and tied it down. He checked the rifle, slid it into the scabbard. The movements felt strange, like he was watching someone else do them. He put a foot in the stirrup and hauled himself up. The horse shifted under his weight, solid and real. From up here, the view was even more staggering. The people seemed to go on forever, fading into the darkness under the trees. They were all looking at him, but there was no hostility. Just a patient, collective waiting. Red Feather mounted his own horse beside him. He did not smile. This was not a happy occasion. It was a solemn, necessary one. He raised his hand, and a low murmur went through the crowd, a soft signal that passed from man to man. Then, without any shouted orders, the great assembly began to move. It was like watching a river start to flow. Riders turned their horses. People on foot fell into lines. Travois poles, carrying the old and the very young and their few possessions, began to scrape softly through the snow. The sound was immense, the sigh of snow, the creak of leather, the soft snorts of horses, the murmur of 1,000 quiet conversations, but it was all hushed, respectful. They were leaving home, and grief hung in the warm wind out pier, and Red Feather moved to the front of the great column, just behind a group of scouts who would find the way. As his horse began to walk, Pierre felt the final thread to his old life snap. He did not look back at the cabin. For a long time, they rode in silence. The sky began to lighten from black to gray, revealing the true scale of the people. There were so many. Warriors with strong faces, their eyes scanning the hills. Women with babies tied to their backs, walking with a steady, tireless pace. Old men, their wisdom etched deep, riding with a straight-backed dignity. Children who looked up at him with wide, curious eyes as he passed on his horse. He was an outsider. A white man with a French song in his heart, riding at the front of a Nez Perce exodus. He felt their eyes, and he wondered what they saw. Did they see a burden? A strange piece of an old promise? Or did they see, as Red Feather seemed to, the Heart Brother? As the weak sun finally broke over the mountain ridges, something happened. From the middle of the column, a voice rose. It was a man's voice, strong and clear, singing a phrase in the Nez Perce language. It was a line of melody that sounded like wind over rocks, like water running. The song was picked up by a few voices nearby. Then more and more. It spread through the moving people like a gentle wave. It was not a song of war. It was not a song of celebration. It was a traveling song. A song of a people on a long, hard journey. It had a steady rhythm to match the walking, a rise and fall like the hills they had to cross. Pierre listened, the unfamiliar words washing over him. He didn't understand them, but he understood the feeling. It was a song of unity, of shared purpose, of carrying sorrow together. Red Feather, riding beside him, glanced over. He began to sing too, his voice lower. Then, after a moment, he nodded toward Pierre. It wasn't a demand. It was an inclusion. You are with us. Pierre's throat was tight. He had nothing to give them but the one thing he had already given. He cleared his throat. His voice, rough and unsure at first, joined not with their words, but with his own. He sang the simple French lullaby, the one about the clear fountain, a La Claire Fontaine. His melody was different. It didn't match theirs. It wove around it, a separate thread. For a few moments, the two songs existed side by side in the cold morning air, the ancient traveling song of the Nez Perce, and the old memory song of a Canadian trapper. Then something beautiful happened. The people near the front, hearing his familiar tune, began to hum it. Their own song softened, blending, making space for his. The two melodies, so different, didn't clash. They became part of the same sound. The sound of a people moving, remembering, carrying all their songs with them into an uncertain future. Pierre sang, and as he sang, he finally understood. This was the settlement of the debt. They hadn't just given him a place among them for his safety. They had given him a family to sing with. They had taken his lonely song and made it part of a chorus. He was no longer a man singing alone in the wilderness. He was a man whose song was now held by hundreds. He rode on, the mountains he knew falling away behind. The path ahead was long, and he knew it held hardship and danger he could not yet imagine. But as the great human river flowed south behind him, and the combined song of two worlds filled the air, Pierre, like Lurk, the solitary trapper, was not afraid. He was not alone. He was the Heart Brother, and he was going home.